The year is 1972. A black man in a three-piece suit steps out of a limousine in rural North Carolina. He's holding a briefcase. Inside that briefcase is $125,000 in cash. Not for a house, not for a car, for a bull. One animal. One walking mountain of muscle and bloodline that white tobacco barons have been bidding on for generations. The auctioneer laughs, thinking it's a joke. Frank Lucas doesn't laugh. "Sell him," Frank says. "I'll take him. Cash. Verified. Clean on paper. You're looking at a man who controls $1 million a day in heroin. The man behind 98% pure blue magic, smuggled in the coffins of dead American soldiers. The invisible king who makes the Italian mafia look like corner boys. But he's standing in a cow barn paying mansion money for breeding rights. Why? Because Frank Lucas understood what every other gangster missed. The loud man dies. The silent man lives. And the king doesn't own the product. The king owns the land the product comes from. While Nicky Barnes poses for magazine covers calling himself Mr. Untouchable, Frank Lucas is buying North Carolina. Thousands of acres. Cattle farms. Hog operations. He's becoming the largest black landowner in the entire state. This isn't a side hustle. This is empire pivot. From dope spots to pastures. From corners to cornfields. From invisible street legend to legitimate land baron. But here's the twist nobody tells you. The bull wasn't just an investment. It was a declaration of war. Against the old white families who'd held that county for a century. Against the banks that said a black man would never own their land. Against the system that murdered his cousin for looking at a white woman wrong. Frank wasn't there to visit. He came to take a throne they never thought he'd sit on. The same red clay his family picked cotton on? Frank was buying it by the 1,000-acre tract. The same auction houses that sold his ancestors? Frank was walking in with briefcases full of heroin money, buying their prize bulls. Respect, power, revenge, all wrapped in a livestock deed. But you can't build a clean empire on dirty money without making one fatal mistake. And Frank did. A single moment of pride that turned his North Carolina dream into federal evidence. Before we get to the chinchilla coat, the raid, and the choice that made him the most hated rat in street history, we have to go back. Back to Bumpy Johnson's deathbed lesson. Back to the Golden Triangle. Back to the moment a sharecropper's grandson decided. The night that built Frank Lucas didn't start with a gun. It started with a scream that cut through the North Carolina darkness like a blade through silk. LaGrange, 1930s. No streetlights, just moonlight on red clay that would stain everything it touched the color of dried blood. Frank is 6 years old, barefoot in the dirt, standing beside his father's sharecropper shack when he hears the truck before he sees it. White voices, drunk and mean, the sound of a chain sliding against metal. His mother grabs his arm tight, pulls him inside, blows out the lantern, and whispers one word that will echo in his mind forever. Quiet. Through the crack in the wood, Frank watches 4 white men drag his cousin Obadiah from his house. No handcuffs, just the barrel of a shotgun pushed into his mouth. The crime wasn't theft or violence. It was reckless eyeballing. Looking at a white woman too long at the general store. For that sin, they string him up from an old oak at the edge of the field, and Frank watches his 19-year-old cousin swing in the night like a silent clock marking the end of innocence. The body hangs for 3 days before they cut it down. No arrests. No investigation. The sheriff writes nothing, files nothing, calls it a disagreement. In that moment, Frank understands something most men die never learning. The law doesn't protect people like him. The law is the weapon used against people like him. He looks at his father, a man who breaks his back from sunrise to sunset farming land he will never own, and realizes the brutal truth. This isn't broken. This is designed. Sharecropping is slavery with a receipt, and every year the white landowner calculates the debt. Seeds, tools, the shack they live in, all borrowed against next season's crop. Every year the numbers somehow never add up in their favor. Frank watches his father age 30 years in a decade, dying slowly on soil that will never belong to him, and the boy makes a decision that will reshape the criminal underworld. He will never play by their rules again. He won't be the victim, he won't be the labor, he will be the owner. Frank's grandmother sees something different in the boy. She's dying of tuberculosis in a back room that smells like kerosene and camphor, coughing blood into rags she hides from the children. She calls Frank to her bedside one August night when the heat makes breathing feel like drowning. Her hand is bone wrapped in paper-thin skin, but her grip is iron when she takes his wrist and plants the seed that will grow into an empire. They can take your money, boy. They can take your life. But they can't take land you own. Write that down in your heart. Land is the only thing that makes a man free. She dies 3 days later, and Frank carries those words like a loaded gun in his chest. By 1946, Frank is in Harlem, expecting freedom, but finding a different kind of plantation. The Italian mafia owns the streets. The Jewish syndicates own the numbers. The black hustlers are just employees, scrambling for crumbs, loud, flashy, and disposable. They wear bright suits to hide the fact that they own nothing. Frank watches them preen on street corners, shouting for attention, and knows they're already dead. They just don't know it yet. While the other young cats chase dice and women, Frank studies power. He watches how white men in expensive suits conduct business over steak dinners, how they speak in code, how they never raise their voices but somehow always get their way, how they own buildings, not corners, how they control supply chains, not street dealers, how they stay invisible while their money works in daylight. Then he meets Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Bumpy. The name alone commands respect from 110th Street to the Bronx. Bumpy doesn't dress flashy or talk loud, but moves through Harlem like a mayor, a general, a king without a crown. He needs a driver, someone smart enough to keep his mouth shut and his eyes open. Frank gets the job not because he's the fastest or toughest, but because when Bumpy asks what he wants, Frank doesn't say money or cars or women. He says, respect. Bumpy smiles, and Frank knows he's passed a test he didn't know he was taking. For 5 years, Frank drives Bumpy to meetings with Italian mobsters, corrupt cops, and politicians who pretend they don't know his name. Frank doesn't talk. He watches. He learns that the Italians are the landowners and the black dealers are the sharecroppers. It's North Carolina all over again. Then in 1968, Bumpy calls him into the back room of a social club on 147th Street. The old man looks tired, his breathing shallow, death sitting in the corner like an uninvited guest. When Bumpy speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper, but every word burns itself into Frank's soul. The loud man dies, Frank. The flashy man gets arrested. The man everybody knows gets betrayed. But the invisible man? The invisible man rules forever. Bumpy Johnson knows he's dying 6 months before his heart actually stops beating. The doctors give him pills that don't work and advice he won't follow, but Bumpy isn't afraid of death. He's afraid of leaving Harlem without a king who understands the game. The air in the back room of Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue is thick enough to chew, smelling of stale cigar smoke and fried fish that never stops cooking. Bumpy sits in his usual corner booth, a glass of cognac untouched on the scarred wooden table, and begins teaching Frank the lessons that will build an empire and destroy the Italian monopoly forever. His heart is failing, ticking down like a crooked clock, but his mind is razor sharp. When he speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper, but every word burns itself into Frank's soul like a brand. "Never let them see you coming," Bumpy says, not looking up from his coffee. "You hear me, country?" Frank nods, but Bumpy's lip curls. He hates half answers. "No. You listen. There's a difference. Hearing is for marks. Listening is for kings." The old man leans forward, his breathing labored but his thoughts crystalline. He explains that the Italian mafia controls heroin because they control the supply chain, but visibility makes them vulnerable to law enforcement and rivals. They buy from Turkish suppliers who sell to French chemists who process it in Marseille, then ship it to New York, where the five families distribute it through black dealers who take all the risk and get none of the profit. "Every hand is a mouth," Bumpy rasps. "Every mouth takes a bite. By the time it hits Harlem, you're paying premium prices for crumbs." Frank watches the old man's eyes, understanding that this isn't about drugs. It's about structure, power, how empires are built, and why they fall. Then comes the revelation that will change the trajectory of the American drug trade forever. Bumpy speaks of a place the news anchors are just starting to mention, a hellscape of jungle and war in Southeast Asia where the poppy fields stretch to the horizon. The Golden Triangle, he whispers like he's sharing the location of buried treasure. Burma, Laos, Thailand, that's where it starts. That's where the real kings sit. Invisible, no posters, no headlines. They move tons and nobody up here even knows their names. The heroin there isn't 10% pure like the Italian garbage flooding Harlem. It's 98% pure, white as snow, strong enough to kill a horse. "Cut out the middlemen," Bumpy instructs, his voice growing weaker but more urgent. "You go to the source. You buy direct. You control purity. You control price. You control everything." Frank asks the question everyone else is too scared to voice. "What about the five families?" Bumpy's eyes harden like flint. "They ain't God. They're landlords." "You've been a sharecropper before, right? How'd that feel?" Frank doesn't answer because he doesn't have to. Bumpy already knows. You've been paying tribute your whole life. To white landowners in Carolina. To these Italian outfits up here, it's all rent. You want to be a tenant or an owner? When Bumpy dies in July 1968, collapsing at Wells Restaurant with a heart that finally gave out, Frank doesn't cry at the funeral. He doesn't give speeches or throw elaborate wakes. While everyone else is mourning and scrambling to fill the power vacuum, Frank goes silent. The Italians call meetings, expecting Bumpy's driver to come begging for product, to kiss the ring and pay tribute like every other black dealer who ever worked their streets. Frank ignores them. Not out of disrespect, but because he's playing a different game entirely. Within months, Frank is on a plane to Bangkok, flying into a war zone to negotiate with Chinese warlords who control the opium trade in the Golden Triangle. He meets with suppliers in jungle compounds guarded by armed men who've been killing since childhood. He negotiates prices in cash, no credit, no promises, just American dollars for uncut heroin that tests at 98% pure. Then comes the masterstroke that will define his legend. Frank bribes military personnel to smuggle the heroin back to the United States in the coffins of dead soldiers killed in Vietnam. The cadaver connection. Death carrying death. Caskets draped in American flags filled with both heroes and poison, flying into military bases where customs inspections are minimal out of respect for the fallen. When Frank's first shipment arrives, 50 kilos of pure heroin that he brands blue magic for the way it looks under light, he doesn't flood the market. He's strategic. He cuts it himself, sells it through his brothers, and prices it lower than the Italian product while keeping it stronger. Within weeks, Blue magic dominates New York streets. The Italian families are hemorrhaging money, watching their customers disappear to a product they can't identify or trace. Frank makes a decision that separates him from every other drug dealer in American history. His first $1 million doesn't go into cars or jewelry or nightclubs. It goes south. North Carolina. Land. The same red clay his ancestors bled on. The question everyone will ask later, when the empire falls, burns in the air like smoke. Why would a heroin kingpin making $1 million a day invest in cattle farms and breeding bulls? Frank Lucas becomes a ghost with a crown, generating $1 million daily while remaining invisible to everyone who matters. By 1970, blue magic is flooding the streets at 98% purity, priced lower than the stepped-on garbage the Italian mafia pushes, and the money pours in like a flood that never stops. But if you walk past Frank in Teaneck, New Jersey, you'd never look twice. No diamond chains, no Rolls-Royce. Just a quiet black man in a modest suit, driving a plain Chevrolet Caprice to a split-level house where his neighbors think he works in sanitation or maybe owns a dry cleaning business. They wave at him on Saturday mornings when he mows his own lawn, completely unaware that the polite man with the regular car controls the purest heroin in America, that his product has made the 5 families look like corner boys selling baking soda. While Nicky Barnes throws parties at Studio 54 wearing custom fur coats and posing for New York Magazine with the headline Mr. Untouchable, Frank understands what Bumpy taught him in that smoky back room. The loud man dies. The visible king gets beheaded. The invisible king stays on the throne forever. Frank's genius lies not just in the product, but in the structure. He doesn't trust outsiders, doesn't hire street hustlers looking for a come-up, doesn't recruit soldiers who might flip when the feds start offering deals. He builds his distribution network entirely from blood. His brothers run the operation. Not friends who call themselves brothers, but actual brothers, born from the same mother, raised in the same North Carolina dirt, bound by loyalty that nah built and money can't break. An undercover cop can infiltrate a crew, can pretend to be a hustler, can earn trust through lies and performance. But he can't infiltrate a bloodline. The Lucas brothers move blue magic through Harlem, the Bronx, and Newark with military precision, and when law enforcement tries to penetrate the organization, they hit a wall of silence that genetics constructed. Family becomes both armor and weapon, creating an unbreachable circle where every face resembles the others, where every nickname goes back 20 years, where every secret is bound by childhood memories and shared blood. But the masterstroke isn't the heroin operation. It's North Carolina. While the FBI is looking for Frank in penthouse apartments and nightclub VIP sections, he's systematically buying farmland in Tidewater County by the 1,000-acre parcel. Tobacco fields, cattle ranches, hog farms. He purchases livestock like he's building an agricultural empire, and then comes the acquisition that becomes legend. A Black Angus breeding bull with bloodlines so pure that white tobacco barons have been bidding on its offspring for generations. The auction house buzzes with the usual suspects, old money families whose grandfathers built fortunes on the backs of enslaved labor. The bidding is fierce, confident white voices calling out numbers that would buy houses. Then Frank steps in with a bid that silences the room. $125,000. Cash. The auctioneer's face goes pale because a black man just outbid every white family in the county for their most prized animal, paying mansion money for breeding rights like he's buying groceries. To white North Carolina, Frank appears as a successful black businessman who made his fortune up north and is investing back home in agriculture. To the ears, his farm income legitimizes his wealth. creating a paper trail so clean it sparkles under audit lights. To law enforcement, he doesn't exist. The psychological warfare is perfect, almost poetic in its justice. Frank is purchasing the same land his ancestors were enslaved on, the same red clay soil his father sharecropped for pennies while dying in debt to white landowners who treated him like livestock. Now Frank owns more property than the families who once owned his people, becoming the largest black landowner in North Carolina. Every deed he signs is a middle finger to a system that declared he'd never be anything but a field hand. The farms become both money laundering machine and fortress of legitimacy, where heroin money flows into cattle sales and drug profits become agricultural investments. Frank walks through his North Carolina property in boots and jeans, inspecting livestock and talking breeding schedules with farmhands who have no idea their soft-spoken boss is the most powerful drug dealer in America. But invisibility extracts a cost Frank didn't calculate when he chose the shadows over the spotlight. His greatest strength becomes his greatest frustration. He's richer than the mafia bosses who used to look down on him, smarter than the flashy dealers who get magazine covers, more powerful than any black gangster in American history. But nobody knows. His wife Julie craves recognition, wants to be seen on his arm at restaurants where the maitre d' knows their name, wants other women to look at her with envy and respect instead of treating her like the wife of a sanitation worker. His brothers grow restless too, tired of moving millions in shadows while nobodies like Nicky Barnes get treated like celebrities. The hunger for acknowledgement begins cracking Frank's discipline like frost-splitting stone. In quiet moments, the question eats at him. If you're the king, but nobody knows it, are you really the king at all? March 1971. The fight of the century, Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden. Every power player in America will be ringside. Mobsters, politicians, celebrities, the world watching. Frank's wife Julie spends a fortune on a chinchilla coat worth $100,000 and a matching hat. Soft as a secret but loud as a gunshot. She brings it to him like an offering and a challenge, begging him to attend, to finally be seen as the king he is. Frank stares at the coat hanging in his closet like it's a loaded gun pointed at everything he's built. One choice will define his legacy and destroy his empire. Stay invisible and keep everything. Or be seen for one night and lose it all. The night Frank Lucas kills his own kingdom starts with a zipper sliding up on a coat that should have stayed in the closet forever. March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century. Ali versus Frazier. Every power player in America will be ringside tonight, and Frank's wife Julie has spent a fortune on chinchilla fur soft as a whisper but loud as a scream. $100,000 wrapped around her husband's shoulders like a death sentence he doesn't see coming. Frank walks through the private entrance in fur that glows under the arena lights, each step announcing what he's spent a decade hiding. The coat flows behind him like liquid silver, more expensive than houses in Harlem, more valuable than the cars parked outside. Julie glows beside him, diamonds catching light, finally able to show the world what she's known in shadows. Her husband isn't nobody. He's a king. Around them, men who think they run New York turn their heads and whisper. Mafia captains in tailored suits, politicians in dark wool, celebrities who measure power by proximity to other power. Their eyes move from the coat to the seats, and the message isn't subtle. Frank isn't in the cheap rows or even the expensive ones. He's ringside, closer to the action than Italian bosses who've controlled the city for 50 years. Better seats than the Dons. Better seats than the mayor. Better seats than Sinatra. For 30 seconds, Frank Lucas is the most powerful man in New York, not because of the money in his pocket, but because of the respect in other men's eyes. The Italian capos nod at him like equals, confused and angry but unable to deny what they see. A black man from cotton fields, sitting on a throne they thought belonged to them. Frank feels the power surge through him like electricity, the recognition he's been denied washing over him like baptism. He is finally, completely, dangerously seen. Up in the stands, Detective Richie Roberts nurses bad coffee and watches the circus below. He's seen every flashy gangster in New York, arrested half of them, but when his partner nudges him and points toward ringside, Roberts sees something that doesn't compute. A man he can't identify in a coat he can't afford sitting where only serious power belongs. Roberts doesn't know Frank's name, doesn't know his operation, doesn't know about Blue Magic or North Carolina or the empire built in shadows. But he knows the coat. He knows that fur costs more than his pension, more than his house, more than anything a legitimate businessman should own. The coat becomes a flare gun fired in a dark room, illuminating everything Frank spent a decade hiding. After the fight, the image burns in Robert's mind like a brand. He starts asking quiet questions around federal offices and police precincts. Who's the man in the chinchilla? Why do the Italians treat him like royalty? The answers don't come easy, because Frank has been invisible for years. But visibility is a disease that spreads through law enforcement like wildfire. Roberts becomes obsessed, turning Frank Lucas into his white whale, following money trails that lead nowhere because cash moves through family hands that don't keep records. But then the breakthrough comes through the most legitimate part of Frank's empire. North Carolina. Land purchases. Cattle sales. A $125,000 breeding bull bought with cash by a man who claims to be a farmer but whose agricultural knowledge seems suspiciously thin. The farms that were supposed to be Frank's shield become evidence of his crimes. Every deed gets scrutinized, every livestock purchase questioned. The Rs calculates how much a bull should cost versus how much Frank paid, and the numbers scream drug money. What was meant to legitimize his wealth now marks him as a target. The thing that made him untouchable on paper makes him visible to federal eyes trained to spot exactly this kind of financial anomaly. Frank feels the heat building like pressure in a boiler. His brothers beg him to run, to take the money and disappear to countries without extradition treaties. But Frank's ego won't let him abandon the throne he finally publicly claimed. He built something impossible, something no black man in American history had ever constructed. Running would mean admitting the system won, that he was just another hustler who got too big for his britches. Pride becomes his anchor, dragging him down while he refuses to cut the rope. The raid comes at dawn on a January morning in 1975, swift and brutal as a military strike. Federal agents hit every property simultaneously. The New Jersey house, the Harlem spots, the North Carolina farms where cattle graze over buried millions. They find $52 million in cash hidden across his properties, stacked in walls, buried in barns, stuffed in places Frank thought were sacred. The empire that took disciplined silence to build crumbles in a single morning because he wore a coat to a boxing match. Frank Lucas sits in federal custody facing 70 years in prison. The prosecutor slides a folder across the metal table. Cooperate against corrupt cops and mafia connections, and maybe see daylight again. The streets have a code older than Frank, simpler than business, absolute as death. Snitches die. But Frank is a businessman staring at a lifetime in a cage, and the choice burns between them like a lit fuse. Stay loyal and die in prison, or become a rat and survive as the most hated man in street history. The cage is 6 feet by 8 feet. But the silence inside stretches to infinity. Frank Lucas sits at a metal table in a federal interrogation room where the air is cold enough to make steel sweat, fluorescent lights humming overhead like a broken halo. 70 years printed across the paperwork in front of him like his own obituary. The prosecutor doesn't yell because he doesn't have to. He just slides the number across scarred metal and waits. The street code is absolute, written in blood older than Frank's grandfather. Death before dishonor. You take the years. You keep your mouth shut. You die for the throne. But Frank Lucas isn't just a gangster who happens to sell heroin. He's a CEO who happens to be black. And CEOs don't make decisions based on emotion or codes written by men who never faced a lifetime in a concrete tomb. They make decisions based on profit and loss, survival and extinction. Bumpy Johnson didn't teach him to be a martyr. Bumpy taught him to be smart. So, Frank makes the calculation that transforms him from legend to the most hated man in street history. He cooperates. The word itself tastes like poison in the mouths of every hustler who ever lived by unwritten laws, but Frank signs the papers and starts talking. He doesn't just give up corner boys or small-time hustlers. He destroys the corrupt Special Investigations Unit of the NYPD, feeding federal prosecutors the names of dozens of dirty detectives who took bribes to protect his operation while stealing his product. He testifies against mafia connections who trusted him, men who sat across tables and broke bread and treated him like an equal when the 5 families wanted him dead. He becomes what the streets hate most, what the code says deserves death more than any crime: a rat. But Frank doesn't see betrayal when he looks in the mirror. He sees survival. He sees the same cold calculation that built an empire from nothing. Why protect a system designed to hunt him? Why show loyalty to corrupt cops who were just rival gangsters with badges? Frank serves 15 years in federal prison, released in 1991, to a world that has completely forgotten his name. The New York he returns to doesn't remember Blue Magic or the Invisible Empire or the man who outsmarted the Italian mafia. Crack cocaine has replaced heroin with chaotic violence that lacks the structure and discipline Frank enforced. He's a relic from another era, a cautionary tale whispered in barbershops about what happens when you get too big and talk too much. The streets move on and forget your name before your body goes cold, and Frank learns that legends have expiration dates stamped in federal ink. He returns to North Carolina not as the largest black landowner in the state, but as a ghost haunting the same red clay his ancestors bled on. The government has seized everything. The farms sold at auction. The cattle scattered to new owners. The $125,000 Black Angus breeding bull that was supposed to symbolize his triumph over the system sold for pennies on the dollar and turned into hamburger meat by men who didn't know its bloodline. The land that was supposed to make him legitimate became the evidence that destroyed him. Every deed became an exhibit in his trial. Every livestock purchase proof of money laundering. Frank walks through Tidewater County in his final years, a thin old man in cheap clothes, past fields he once owned, and the irony cuts deeper than any prison sentence. He tried to beat the system by playing their game, buying their land, following their rules on paper while breaking them in practice. But the system doesn't lose. It just waits. The cycle completed itself with cruel poetry. Then Hollywood calls. Denzel Washington wants to play him. American Gangster releases in 2007, and suddenly Frank Lucas is a legend again, but a different kind. Not the invisible king who controlled the purest heroin in America, but a movie character, a symbol wrapped in entertainment. Frank watches himself on screen, sees Denzel wear the chinchilla coat, sees the empire rise and fall in 2 hours with popcorn and soda, and something hollow settles in his chest. The streets still hate him. Former associates still call him a rat. But teenagers who weren't born when he ran Harlem now recognize his name because a movie star played him. Frank Lucas dies in 2019 at 88 years old in Cedar Grove, New Jersey, in a modest apartment that would fit inside the closet of his old North Carolina farmhouse. In his final years, Frank must reconcile two identities that can't coexist. The man who built an impossible empire that proved a black kid from cotton fields could outthink the mafia and become the largest landowner in North Carolina. And the man who betrayed the code to survive, who chose life in poverty over death with honor, who lost everything because he wore a coat to a boxing match. So answer this, because Frank took the question to his grave. He bought a $125,000 bull to prove he was more than a gangster. He became the largest black landowner in North Carolina to prove the system was wrong about his people. But he lost everything because he needed to be seen for one night. Is it better to be invisible and keep your kingdom, or to be recognized once and watch it all burn? Was the throne worth the price of his soul?